Greetings, kindred. We're going to continue our study on the book of Ezekiel. We're in chapter 17. Today we're going to begin with verse 6. So if you missed the first part, you want to go back and listen to that so you can get up to speed with this book of Ezekiel. Even start from the beginning. Chapter 1 would be best if you haven't listened to any of those yet. Okay, well, let's get started. Ezekiel, whose name means El is strong, or whom Elohim strengthens, was directly commanded by our Father in the 17th chapter to put forth a riddle and a parable to the house of Israel. Why? Just to give us brain teaser? Well, perhaps that is not too far from the actual reason, because he certainly wants those who are capable to use their brains for something other than just listening to and blindly following preachers and ministers, especially those who do not adhere to the word of Yahweh. A case in point, we learned in our last study that Jeremiah prophesied that there would be a siege and a 70-year captivity, but the people rather believed their leaders, not the prophet from Yahweh, who foolishly told them Yahweh would surely protect his temple. Surprise! Now, there's a really good example of not using one's brains. If Yahweh destroyed the entire surface of the planet in the first earth age because his children didn't listen to him, what are the chances he'd spare a mere building for the same disobedience? Go figure. Anyway, the fact is there is something extremely important in this 17th chapter that our Father wants us to see and understand, and by using our minds to figure it out, perhaps we will continue to let the wheels turn in our heads for a little while longer and think about it. The biblical term is meditate. Now, he could not have made it any simpler for us to see and understand what is being discussed in this chapter. In fact, it is as easy as ABC. A. In verses 1 through 10, we are given the actual parable along with the question, shall it prosper or shall it be successful? B. Then in verses 11 through 23, the parable itself, meaning verses 1 through 10, is explained. Again, along with the question, shall it prosper or shall it be successful? And if that isn't enough simplicity, all of the details concerning this parable, including people's names, are well recorded in 2 Kings 24 through 25. Those are chapters, by the way. C. Then in verses 22 through 24, we are given the final information necessary to put everything in context and perspective and completely solve the riddle. Let us now continue with the parable. Nebuchadnezzar had taken the highest branch, Jehoiachin, captive, and set up a seed in his stead, who was Zedekiah, to be king over Judah. Verse 6 continues concerning this seed. Ezekiel 17, verse 6. And it grew and became a spreading vine of low stature, whose branches turned toward him, and the roots thereof were under him. So it became a vine, and brought forth branches, and shot forth sprigs. Nebuchadnezzar did not want Judah to regain stature as a formidable power, so he carried away about 8,000 of the chief men of Judah. Zedekiah also became fruitful and had many sons, 10 in all, and also 2 daughters. To understand this next verse, we need to know that King Zedekiah, the seed in verse 5, made an oath and a covenant, which is what those branches turned toward, whose branches turned toward him means in verse 6, with the king of Babylon to be loyal and submissive to him. But Zedekiah will look toward Pharaoh of Egypt to align himself against Nebuchadnezzar. Therefore, Zedekiah's word was no good, was it? Yahweh doesn't respect people like that. Verse 7, there was also another great eagle with great wings and many feathers, and behold, this vine did bend her roots toward him, and shot forth her branches toward him, that he might water it by the furrows of her plantation. This great eagle was Pharaoh Hophra of Egypt, from along the great river Nile. Zedekiah broke his oath of loyalty to Nebuchadnezzar and turned towards Pharaoh of Egypt, as verse 15 explains. Verse 8, it was planted in a good soil by great waters, that it might bring forth branches, and that it might bear fruit, that it might be a goodly vine. King Zedekiah was looking to Pharaoh for help and protection from King Nebuchadnezzar. Now remember that Yahweh through Jeremiah said that the captivity would be for 70 years. Do you think that the power and strength of Egypt can change Yahweh's plan? Zedekiah, who should have had eyes to see and ears to hear the word of Yahweh spoken by Jeremiah, will eventually have those eyes put out by King of Babylon after witnessing all of his sons killed because of his actions. Here is the "Thus saith Yahweh Elohim" question that applies to the riddle. Verse 9, say thou, "Thus saith Yahweh Elohim, shall it prosper? Shall he not pull up the roots thereof and cut off the fruit thereof, that it wither? It shall wither, and all the leaves of her spring, even without great power or many people to pluck it up by the roots thereof." Can a person or even a nation circumvent Yahweh's plan? Can a person or a nation prosper on its own apart from Yahweh? Sorry, pal. When Yahweh says a thing is going to happen, it is going to happen. Anything or anyone who gets in the way will be summarily crushed and removed. In this case, it didn't take much power from Nebuchadnezzar acting as the servant of Yahweh to crush the rebellion. Verse 10, yea, behold, being planted, shall it prosper? Shall it not utterly wither when the east wind toucheth it? It shall wither in the furrows where it grew. Go ahead, try things your own way, especially during the siege of the king of Babylon, and see how fast the scorching east wind dries it up, and it withers away without ever getting off the ground. The only way to produce fruit is to do things Yahweh's way, according to his plan. Ezekiel 17, verse 11. Moreover, the word of Yahweh came unto me, saying, Ezekiel is instructed to explain to the rebellious house that would be the rebellious house of Israel, what these things mean that he just told them in a parable. Verse 12, say now to the rebellious house, know ye not what these things mean? Tell them, behold, the king of Babylon is come to Jerusalem, and hath taken the king thereof and the princes thereof, and led them with him to Babylon. It is important to notice that only the princes were taken and not the daughters. Verse 13. And hath taken of the king's seed and made a covenant with him, and hath taken an oath of him. He hath also taken the mighty of the land. Nebuchadnezzar took Zedekiah, who made a covenant and swore his loyalty to him. He also took many mighty men so that the kingdom would not become a powerhouse. Next verse. Yet would remain a nation. Verse 14. That the kingdom might be base, that it might not lift itself up, but that by keeping of his covenant it might stand. However, Zedekiah could not let well enough alone and sought the alliance of Egypt. Verse 15. But he rebelled against him in sending his ambassadors into Egypt, that they might give him horses and much people. Shall he prosper? Shall he escape that doeth such things? Or shall he break the covenant and be delivered? What do you think? How could he possibly succeed if he is going against Yahweh's plan? Zedekiah will try to escape, but he will be captured by the king of Babylon. Verse 16. As I live, saith Yahweh Elohim, surely in the place where the king dwelleth that made him king, whose oath he despised and whose covenant he brake, even with him in the midst of Babylon he shall die. And so, as it is written, King Zedekiah did die in the midst of Babylon, which is to say, in the midst of confusion, which is what Babel means. Verse 17. Neither shall Pharaoh with his mighty army and great company make for him in the war by casting up mounts and building forts to cut off many persons. Verse 18. Seeing he despised the oath by breaking the covenant, when lo, he had given his hand and hath done all these things, he shall not escape. Try to circumvent the word of Yahweh after you were warned about the captivity, Zedekiah. Break your solemn oaths which you made as king of Yahweh's people, and that you gave with your word of honor by your handshake, and then try to escape with your life? I don't think so, Zedekiah. Verse 19. Thus saith Yahweh Elohim, as I live, surely mine oath that he hath despised, and my covenant that he hath broken, even it will I recompense upon his own head. You're in big trouble, Zedekiah. Verse 20. And I will spread my net upon him, and he shall be taken in my snare, and I will bring him to Babylon, and will plead with him there for his trespass that he hath trespassed against me. Verse 21. And all his fugitives with all his bands shall fall by the sword, and they that remain shall be scattered toward all winds, and ye shall know that I, Yahweh, have spoken it. We have now seen the parable and the explanation thereof. Tomorrow we will read the exciting conclusion to this chapter, and the simple riddle we are to see will become obvious if it hasn't already. However, as a fitting conclusion to today's study, we will leave you with the following narrative, excerpt from the Dictionary of the Bible, edited by James Hastings and published by Charles Scribner's Sons, New York, 1963. Note, the underlines are not contained in the text, but have been added by yours truly, who believes this excerpt will help put what we've learned into perspective in preparation for our next study. Enjoy. Zedekiah, the last king of Judah before its fall at the hands of the Babylonians, is known to us not only from the historical books, but also from references in the book of Jeremiah. He was the third son of Josiah to assume the royal title. Jehoahaz was deposed by the Pharaoh. Jehoiakim had a troubled reign of 11 years and escaped the vengeance of Nebuchadnezzar by dying just before the Babylonian reached Jerusalem. The young Jehoiakim suffered for the sin of his father, being carried into captivity after 3 months of barren kingship. With him were carried away the chief men of Judah to the number of 8,000, Nebuchadnezzar thinking thus to break the temper of the people. Over the remnant left behind, Zedekiah was made king. His earlier name, Mattaniah, was changed to Zedekiah, meaning righteousness of Yahweh, to indicate that the Babylonian monarch, in punishing the treachery of Jehoiakim, had the Yahweh of Judah on his side. 2 Kings 24, verse 17. We are told by Ezekiel, that's chapter 17, verse 13 and 19, that Zedekiah took an oath of allegiance to his suzerain. And here's the quote. Nebuchadnezzar's confidence that the people would be submissive after the severe lesson they had received was disappointed. The new men who came to the front were as headstrong as, and even more foolish than, their predecessors. They were blind to the ludicrous insufficiency of their resources and determined to play the game of politics against the great nations of the world. The court of Zedekiah was the center of intrigues against the Babylonian power, and the plotters were fed with promises from Egypt. Zedekiah showed himself a weak man, unable to cope with the situation. In his 4th year, ambassadors who appeared at Jerusalem from the surrounding nations to concert common measures against the oppressor. The majority of the prophets encouraged the movement. Only Jeremiah saw the madness of the undertaking and declared against it. His bold declaration of the truth brought upon him the enmity of the courtiers. Zedekiah seems to have been called to account by the great king, to whom he made some explanation which satisfied him, or at least lulled suspicion for a time. The movement itself came to nothing at this time, but in Zedekiah's 9th year, renewed promises from Egypt induced Jerusalemites to revolt, and Zedekiah was too weak to restrain them. Nebuchadnezzar replied promptly by marching in person against the rebels. Jerusalem was a stronghold in which the people had confidence, and they seem to also have believed fanatically that Yahweh would intervene to protect his temple. This faith was raised to a high pitch by the approach of an Egyptian army under Pharaoh Hophra, for Nebuchadnezzar was compelled to raise the siege to meet the new enemy. The expression of the people's confidence that they had got from Yahweh all that they desired is seen in the indecent haste with which they reduced again to slavery the servants whom they had set free in order to obtain his favor. The joy was short-lived. The Egyptians were hardly a serious problem to Nebuchadnezzar, and soon left him free to resume the siege, which he did with energy. The strongly fortified city was defended by its inhabitants with the courage of despair, and held out a year and a half. During this time, they suffered all the horrors of siege, famine, and pestilence. Jeremiah, who still predicted the disaster, was arrested and would have perished in his dungeon had it not been for the compassion of one of the king's slaves. That's Jeremiah 38. Zedekiah, who believed in him, consulted with him by stealth, but could not nerve himself to follow the advice he received. When at last the wall was breached, the king attempted to escape to the Jordan Valley, hoping thus to gain the eastern desert, the eastern desert. But he was overtaken and carried to Nebuchadnezzar. The victor, considering that forbearance had ceased to be a virtue, slew the captive king's children before his eyes, then blinded the king himself and carried him away in chains to Babylon. The kingdom of Judah had come to an end. 2 Kings 25. H.P. Smith. Okay, that concludes today's study. We'll pick it up next time, beginning with chapter 17, verse 22. Until then, be blessed and stay in the Word. Yahweh bless.